Hey guys, tonight we're walking down the tight, uneven sidewalks of South Philadelphia, where the smell of bread baking drifts out from corner bakeries, and the sound of a street vendor calling out for customers blends with the rumble of passing trolleys. In the spring air, laundry sways between row houses, and kids kick dented cans in the gutter without a care. The scene feels ordinary, almost cozy. But beneath this neighborhood warmth, quiet stories move through back rooms, whispers in bars, and the silent exchange of envelopes over cafe counters. This is where a boy named Testa learns how the world works, not from books, but from the rhythm of a street where loyalty buys more than money ever could. You probably won't survive this place if you don't learn the rules fast, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Phil's earliest memories aren't framed by playgrounds or school desks. They're anchored in the dimly lit backroom of his father's poultry shop, where the scent of fresh feathers mixed with the sharp tang of sawdust floors. Chickens clucked in wire cages stacked 3 high, their restless shifting a constant soundtrack. His father's hands, broad, scarred, and quick, moved with the certainty of a man who'd repeated the same motions for decades. Phil learned that kind of certainty by watching, absorbing the quiet discipline in every gesture. School was never the center of his life. Attendance was sporadic. The pull of the shop and the streets always won out. By 10 years old, he knew how to pluck and dress a bird faster than most grown men. By 12, he understood which customers paid in cash, which ones paid late, and which ones needed a little more persuasion to settle up. That knowledge didn't come from lectures. It came from listening at the edges of adult conversations, where men spoke low and serious over cups of black coffee. South Philly in those years wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a small, breathing world. Italian immigrants packed in close, not just for convenience, but for survival. Women traded recipes on stoops. Men in fedoras gathered on corners to smoke and argue about baseball scores. Everyone knew everyone else's business, but not everyone spoke of it. That unspoken code, that sense of we keep it in the family, wasn't limited to blood relatives. It was the mortar that held the community together, and Phil understood it before he could shave. The first time he noticed the difference between his father's respectable customers and those who came in from the other side of town, he was maybe 13. They dressed sharper, their shoes always shined, but their eyes were colder. They didn't haggle over price, didn't waste words, and never seemed to wait in line. They'd nod to his father, who would disappear into the back with them for a few minutes, returning with a brown paper parcel tied in twine. No receipts, no small talk. Phil filed it away. Transactions weren't always about poultry. It was around this time he began running small errands, delivering sealed envelopes to addresses where curtains twitched and doors opened just enough for him to slip the package inside. At first, he didn't think much of it. It was work. And in South Philly, work was work. But he learned quickly that certain deliveries brought him an extra couple of dollars and a pat on the shoulder from his father's friends. Those extra dollars bought him his first real pair of leather shoes, and with them came a different kind of respect from the older boys on the block. By the late 1940s, the city's working-class neighborhoods were in a slow, grinding recovery from the war. Jobs were scarce, and opportunity rarely knocked without a little encouragement. For a teenager like Phil, the path forward was narrow. Stay in the shop, marry a local girl, raise a family, or step into the longer shadows cast by the men who moved through South Philly like they owned the pavement. He began spending more evenings near the corner of 9th and Christian, where the conversations were sharper, the jokes carried double meanings, and the men laughed without ever really smiling. Many of them had known Angelo Bruno, already a respected figure in the city's quiet underworld, and Bruno, in turn, knew of Phil. The older man appreciated young people who listened more than they talked. Phil listened. Always. He learned that power in South Philadelphia wasn't shouted, it was spoken softly, with the confidence of someone who could have you fed and forgotten before lunch. He learned which debts could be forgiven and which ones couldn't, no matter who you were. He learned that in this world, favors weren't free. They were investments that matured over years. And most importantly, he learned to make himself useful without ever seeming desperate to belong. By 19, he was working the poultry shop by day and running collections for a neighborhood bookmaker by night. The work was steady, the money better than anything a factory could offer, and the thrill of being trusted with grown men's business was a reward in itself. There was danger, of course, occasional whispers of someone being sent away for talking too much or siding with the wrong man. But Phil, even in youth, knew how to walk a careful line. When he looked back years later, those early days seemed almost innocent compared to what came after. Yet, they were the foundation of everything. His understanding of loyalty, of calculated patience, and of the value of keeping your mouth shut when you knew more than you should. South Philadelphia had given him a map, and every block, every corner, every back room was a lesson waiting to be learned. Phil's teenage years rolled forward under the steady hum of South Philly's daily life, but the Chicken Man nickname wasn't yet his own. It was something whispered about him in the casual way the neighborhood assigned identities. His father's poultry shop was the most visible part of the Testa family, and anyone who grew up around there knew the smell of fresh chicken and sawdust was their signature. But the name itself, lightly mocking, affectionately teasing, stuck because it carried a sense of familiarity. It started with a couple of the older kids on the block. They'd see him walking home in his butcher's apron, a bit of feather stuck to his sleeve, and call out, "Hey, Chicken Man, got anything for Sunday dinner?" At first, he laughed it off. Then, without him noticing, it became a shorthand even some of the local bookmakers used when referring to him. In South Philadelphia, nicknames were currency. Sometimes a shield, sometimes a target. This one was a little of both. He didn't fight it. In fact, Phil learned quickly that leaning into the nickname gave him a sort of unthreatening charm. It was easier to get people talking when they thought of you as the kid with the poultry shop, rather than a young man quietly collecting debts or passing sealed envelopes. That harmless, almost comical image let him slide past suspicion more than once. The shop itself was a lesson in human behavior. Every customer who walked through the door had a story. The older women who came in with exact change and insisted on the freshest bird. The dock workers who ordered in bulk, always in a hurry, always watching the clock. The priests who never paid full price but always blessed the family with a smile. And then there were the quiet customers, the ones who came late in the day, bought very little, and spoke even less. Phil learned to read them all. One afternoon, a man named Tony Bananas Caponegro, already known in certain circles for his ambition, came in for a small order. He chatted lightly with Phil, asking about the shop, the family, and how business was. Phil didn't think much of it at the time, but later He'd realized Caponegro was the kind of man who was always scouting, always assessing who could be useful. The exchange was polite, brief, but it planted a seed. The 1950s rolled in with change across the city. Philadelphia was still rough in parts, but post-war money was beginning to seep in. New construction projects popped up, factories hummed, and the organized crime families adjusted their focus. Gambling dens expanded, loan sharking grew more lucrative, and the unions became a battlefield for influence. Phil watched all of this from the edges, his role still small, but expanding in subtle ways. By his early 20s, his father's health began to slip. That meant more responsibility for Phil, both in the shop and beyond it. He took over the books, kept the deliveries running, and made sure debts owed to the shop were collected without involving outsiders. But he also started handling other collections for men who weren't customers in the traditional sense. This dual role, legitimate and not, wasn't uncommon in the neighborhood, but Phil wore it well. He knew how to play both sides. With the shopkeepers and old families, he was respectful, dependable, always ready to lend a hand. With the street guys, he was quick, discreet, and careful not to overstep. That balance earned him trust from both camps, and in South Philly, trust was the closest thing to a golden ticket. The nickname Chicken Man took on new life in those years. It became a way for certain people to talk about him in mixed company without raising eyebrows. Someone could say, "The Chicken Man will handle it," and half the room would think it meant poultry delivery, while the other half knew it meant something entirely different. Many people still think that his nickname kept him from being taken seriously early on, but the truth is, it was a kind of camouflage. So what do you think? Was it better to be underestimated or feared? One story from that time still circulates in whispers. Phil was asked to deliver a payment to a bookmaker in a neighboring district. A simple errand, supposedly. When he arrived, the bookmaker was short on cash and tried to bluff his way out. Phil didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. He simply placed the sealed envelope on the table, stepped back, and waited. The silence stretched until the man shifted in his seat and pulled the missing bills from a hidden drawer. Phil left without a word. No drama, no mess. Just quiet pressure. That's when some of the older guys began to look at him differently. By the end of the decade, his reputation, half built on poultry, half on something less innocent, was solid. He wasn't running anything big yet, but he was known. Known for keeping his word. Known for never talking out of turn. Known for making things right without leaving a trail. The Chicken Man might have been a name for a butcher's son, but Phil was slowly turning it into a name you didn't forget. Phil's climb into the deeper layers of Philadelphia's underworld didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn, the kind that went unnoticed, until one day people realized he wasn't just the kid from the poultry shop anymore. By the early 1960s, his quiet errands had evolved into something more deliberate. He'd learned that in the mob, the men who lasted weren't the loudest or the quickest to throw a punch. They were the ones who could read a room, keep a secret, and never, ever let their emotions spill into their business. Phil fit that mold perfectly. His apprenticeship in crime began under men who had been part of the city's organized rackets since Prohibition. These weren't the brash street enforcers who liked to be seen. They were the calm operators who could walk through a crowd without drawing a single glance. One of them, an older bookmaker named Carlo, took a liking to Phil. Carlo's advice was simple: watch everyone, trust almost no one, And remember that patience will make you rich before anger ever will. Phil kept that line in the back of his mind for years. The early jobs were small, but important. Collecting overdue payments, carrying messages that couldn't be trusted to the phone, and occasionally keeping watch outside backroom meetings. He never asked questions. That, more than anything, impressed the veterans. In a world where curiosity could be fatal, his restraint was a rare gift. He also learned the unspoken etiquette of mob business: when to light someone's cigarette, when to step out of the room, when to speak, and when to let the silence do the talking. The older guys noticed he didn't try to mimic their swagger or force familiarity. He just absorbed, learned, and executed. That approach made him a safe pair of hands in situations that could have gone wrong fast. It was around this time he began interacting more with Angelo Bruno, a man whose style was the opposite of flashy. Bruno didn't need to raise his voice to command respect, and Phil found himself quietly studying the way the older man worked a table, the way he turned every conversation into an agreement, without anyone realizing they'd been persuaded. Many people still think that Phil modeled his entire approach to leadership after Bruno's subtle style, and while that's partly true, there was also something distinctly his own, an even deeper patience, as if he was always willing to wait one more move than his opponent. The 1960s also brought shifts in the city's underworld. New faces were trying to muscle in, and older figures were protecting their turf more fiercely than ever. Phil's role began to grow as the trusted go-between for disputes that needed calming before they spiraled into violence. He wasn't an enforcer in the traditional sense. He didn't leave bruises, but he left an impression. If he visited your shop to talk, you didn't forget it. One notable moment came when a small-time operator named Frankie tried to run a numbers game on a corner already claimed by a Bruno associate. Instead of sending muscle, Phil paid Frankie a visit alone. He ordered a coffee, listened to Frankie's excuses, and then, without raising his voice, explained how this particular corner had been spoken for longer than Frankie had been alive. By the end of the conversation, Frankie agreed to shut it down, and Phil even sent him toward a different block where business was slower but safer. Bruno heard about it, and the quiet efficiency of the resolution didn't go unnoticed. His nickname, by now, had a different weight. The Chicken Man wasn't just the son of a poultry shop owner. It was shorthand in certain circles for a man who handled things without noise, without spectacle, and without loose ends. For Phil, the key was staying useful without being threatening. It allowed him to operate across the network of Bruno's associates without anyone feeling like he was stepping on their toes. There were lessons along the way, too. Once, he was asked to keep watch on a deal taking place in a warehouse near the river. It seemed routine until federal agents swarmed in faster than anyone expected. Phil slipped out through a side door, blending into a group of longshoremen heading home for the night. That narrow escape taught him something he'd repeat to younger men years later. In this life, sometimes the smartest move you make is the one no one notices. By the decade's end, Phil's place in the Philadelphia crime family was cemented. He wasn't yet a power player, but he was inside the circle, and in the mob, proximity to the right people was everything. The poultry shop was still there, still a legitimate front, but its role had shifted. Fewer chickens were sold, and more of the shop's back room was reserved for private conversations, the kind that ended with handshakes and envelopes rather than sales receipts. Phil Testa had gone from a quiet errand runner to a trusted apprentice in the business of organized crime. The nickname might have sounded harmless, but behind it was a man who had learned that power often came not from being feared in the streets, but from being indispensable in the shadows. By the early 1970s, Phil Testa's quiet rise had drawn him ever closer to Angelo Bruno, the man who had kept Philadelphia's underworld remarkably steady for years. Bruno's style was a rarity in the mob. He avoided unnecessary bloodshed, preferred negotiation over muscle, and focused on maintaining steady profits rather than chasing every new opportunity. Phil admired this approach. In a world where ambition often burned too hot, Bruno seemed to thrive by keeping the flame low and controlled. Their bond had grown out of mutual respect. Phil wasn't loud, didn't try to impress, and most importantly, didn't overstep. Bruno valued that. He had no use for men who mistook proximity for privilege. The chicken man had proven himself over and over, handling delicate disputes, keeping order among restless associates, and never making a move that could embarrass or undermine his boss. South Philly saw them together more often now, sharing a table at a quiet restaurant, walking side by side down Passyunk Avenue, or slipping into the back of a union hall for a meeting. These sightings carried weight. To be seen with Bruno was to be acknowledged as part of the trusted inner circle. It was also a warning to anyone thinking of testing Phil's resolve. Their conversations rarely touched on the street gossip that kept other mobsters entertained. Bruno preferred to talk about business in broad strokes, shipping arrangements, casino revenue from Atlantic City, political connections that could be maintained or strengthened. Phil listened more than he spoke, absorbing the subtleties of how Bruno moved pieces without drawing attention to his hand. It was Bruno who gave Phil one of his most enduring lessons. Never show all your strength at once. Keep something in reserve. It's what makes people hesitate before they decide to cross you. Phil carried that with him like a personal code. The two men were different in some ways. Bruno was known for his charm, his ability to make even rivals feel at ease before negotiating them into a corner. Phil, on the other hand, was more reserved. His warmth came in smaller doses, but when he gave you his word, it had weight. Many people still think that without Bruno's mentorship, Phil might never have reached the position he did. But there's another view. That Bruno's trust in him wasn't charity. It was recognition of a man who could one day carry the weight of the family. So what do you think? Was Phil shaped by Bruno, or was he already on that path long before? One telling example of their bond came during a tense period with a crew from New Jersey. A dispute over territory threatened to spill into open conflict. Bruno sent Phil to meet with their representative, not to negotiate terms, but to gauge whether the man could be reasoned with. Phil returned with a simple assessment. He'll take a deal if it comes with respect. If not, he'll keep pushing. Bruno smiled at the brevity, knowing that Phil had read the man's pride as clearly as a ledger. They also shared an understanding of discretion. Neither man felt the need to announce their plans or their wins. If a problem was handled, it was handled. No press conferences, no boasting. In an era when younger mobsters were becoming more reckless, showing off cars and clothes they couldn't explain, Bruno and Phil stayed understated. This, ironically, made them more powerful. By this time, Phil was also helping Bruno maintain control over certain unions. He wasn't the public face of these operations. He preferred to keep his influence indirect, working through trusted intermediaries who knew not to make a move without his nod. This kind of control was less glamorous than running high-stakes games or flashy rackets, but it was steady. Unions meant dues, and dues meant a dependable stream of income that law enforcement found harder to trace. The two men's relationship wasn't without its challenges. Trust in the mob is a fragile thing, and proximity to the boss often breeds envy. Some within the Philadelphia family saw Phil as too close to Bruno, perhaps a future successor. That kind of talk could be dangerous. But Phil handled it the way he always had, by keeping his head down, doing the work, and letting results speak for themselves. In the back room of a South Philly restaurant one winter night, Bruno raised a glass to Phil and said, "You're steady, Phil. Steady is rare in this business. Don't lose it." For a man like Bruno, that was as close to an endorsement as anyone could hope for. The years spent under Bruno's wing were shaping Phil not just as a mob figure, but as a leader in waiting. He was learning the value of patience, the necessity of subtlety, and the importance of leaving just enough mystery about your next move. Lessons that, in time, he would need more than ever. By the mid-1970s, Phil Testa had moved beyond errands and quiet negotiations. He was no longer just a trusted lieutenant. He was an integral part of the machinery that kept Philadelphia's underworld humming. The climb had been deliberate, almost methodical, and while others had made their way up through intimidation or open displays of power, Phil had done it through a kind of calm persistence that felt out of step with the volatility of mob politics. The turning point came in a series of moves that positioned him as more than just a reliable hand for Bruno. One of those moves involved a dispute over the control of certain gambling operations in South Jersey. A younger, hot-headed crew had begun operating without permission, emboldened by the spread of legal casinos in Atlantic City. Most expected Bruno to send someone to make an example out of them. Instead, he sent Phil. The result? No bodies, no headlines. Just a quiet handshake and a realignment of revenue streams that left everyone making more money than before. Phil's ability to turn a near war into a business arrangement became a whispered point of respect. By now, he had influence in multiple rackets: loans, gambling, Shylock operations, and union manipulation. Each was handled in the same understated way. No flashy cars, no showy spending. In a time when some mobsters were letting their egos write checks, reality couldn't cash. Phil was almost invisible outside his circles. That invisibility was his strength. South Philly's street corners were full of talkers, guys who'd tell you how much they made, how feared they were, and how much respect they commanded. Phil knew better. He'd seen enough to understand that the loudest voices often ended up silenced first. He kept his own counsel, and when he spoke, people listened. Still, ambition has a way of creating shadows. His steady rise brought him into closer contact with rivals within the Philadelphia family. Some thought he was too much in Bruno's favor. Others saw him as a potential roadblock to their own aspirations. It wasn't open hostility yet, but Phil had the instincts to feel when eyes lingered too long and smiles didn't reach the eyes. Around this time, his nickname began to take on a life of its own outside mob circles. In neighborhoods far from South Philly, the Chicken Man was just a colorful figure you heard about in bars, a man with one foot in the poultry shop and the other in backroom deals. Many people still think this wider awareness was harmless, but Phil wasn't so sure. Visibility could bring attention from the wrong places. Not just law enforcement, but rival crews who might see you as a target. So what do you think? Did the nickname protect him by making him sound less dangerous? Or did it paint a bigger target on his back? One story from this period says a federal agent tailing a suspected mob meeting reported in frustration that the Chicken Man just walked right past me with a paper bag full of something, and I couldn't do a thing because it might have been chicken. Whether true or embellished, it captures how the blend of legitimate business and shadow dealings kept him slippery in the eyes of the law. Inside the family, Phil's stock kept rising. He was now handling more delicate situations, often as the first call when tensions flared between crews. Bruno used him as both a fixer and a barometer. If Phil thought someone could be brought into line, it was worth trying. If Phil warned they were too far gone, action usually followed. This trust didn't just happen. It was earned in dozens of small moments over years. Moments when Phil could have advanced himself at someone else's expense, but didn't. The mid to late 70s were also the years when the Atlantic City casino boom began reshaping organized crime in the region. Phil understood that this wasn't just about gambling profits. It was about influence over unions, construction contracts, and supply chains. He made himself valuable in those areas, sometimes as a silent partner, sometimes as a discreet enforcer of agreements. The more he learned, the more he saw that his approach, quiet, deliberate, and patient, wasn't just his personal style, it was his armor. Others might burn hot and bright, but Phil preferred to burn slow, knowing that survival in the mob was as much about endurance as it was about power. Phil Testa's rise in the 1970s also ran parallel to a city in flux. Philadelphia was not the same place it had been in his youth. The old neighborhood rhythms were still there, but the edges had grown sharper. Factories were closing, unemployment was climbing, and the streets carried a different kind of tension. For organized crime, this meant opportunity and risk in equal measure. Bruno, still holding the reins of the Philadelphia family, kept to his philosophy of steady profits over reckless expansion. Phil was often his quiet point man in the business of vice, bookmaking, loans, and union deals that greased the machinery of the underworld. While other crews chased quick scores, Phil helped maintain the stability that Bruno prized. His influence was felt most strongly in the gambling rackets. Numbers games and sports betting were the lifeblood of the family's income, and Phil oversaw territories where the flow of money stayed consistent and disputes stayed rare. He had a knack for solving problems before they boiled over, pulling a bookmaker aside for a quiet word, rearranging territories without bruising egos, or cutting small deals that kept everyone feeling like they'd won something. The loan sharking side of things demanded a different skill set. This wasn't the kind of lending you found at a bank. These loans came with interest rates that could make your head spin, and failure to pay had consequences. Phil managed this with the same calm precision as everything else. He didn't need to make threats often. People knew he could back up his words if necessary. More importantly, they knew he didn't forget debts. Ever. One man who owed him money later told a reporter, long after Phil's time, that dealing with the chicken man was scarier than dealing with most street enforcers because he never raised his voice, but you knew if you crossed him, you wouldn't get a second chance. Many people still think that Phil's restraint was a weakness, but history suggests it was the opposite. So what do you think? Is quiet control more effective than loud intimidation? Union involvement brought a different set of players into his orbit. Politicians, labor leaders, and businessmen who weren't part of the mob, but were perfectly willing to benefit from its muscle. Phil was a master at navigating these relationships. He knew how to make someone feel like they were in control, while gently steering them toward the outcome he wanted. Contracts moved, disputes vanished, and votes appeared where they were needed. The neighborhood still saw him as the man from the poultry shop. He kept that image alive deliberately, even as the backroom dealings expanded. The front of the shop stayed open, the counters still lined with fresh chickens, the same sawdust on the floor. For some, it was a nostalgic fixture. For Phil, it was also a shield, a place where he could meet without raising suspicion, a reminder of his roots, and a subtle message that he wasn't too big to forget where he came from. But the business of vice came with constant pressure. The FBI was watching more closely, building cases quietly. Wiretaps became more sophisticated. Friends turned into informants. Phil knew the risks, but he also knew that in this world, you didn't slow down because the law was watching. You just got better at staying a step ahead. He rotated meeting spots, changed routines, and never used the phone for anything important. There's a story from this era about a night in an Atlantic City lounge. An associate leaned in to tell Phil about a problem with a rival crew moving into their territory. Instead of answering directly, Phil picked up a piece of bread, tore it in half, and said, "This is how you keep your half. Don't let them take a bite." It was his way of saying, hold your ground, but don't start a war you don't need. By the close of the decade, his reputation was solid across every layer of the Philadelphia mob. He was a man who could be trusted with sensitive business, who wouldn't talk out of turn, and who could make a problem disappear without creating 3 more in the process. The Chicken Man had gone from a neighborhood nickname to a symbol of quiet, effective power, one that was about to be tested in ways no one in South Philly could have predicted. The 1970s in Philadelphia's underworld were a paradox, steady under Bruno's leadership, yet simmering with undercurrents of change. For Phil Testa, those years were about consolidating his position, making sure every move he made strengthened his footing. The mob wasn't a place where you could coast. Even in peaceful times, there was always someone watching for an opening. Philadelphia in that era was a patchwork of influences. Old world Sicilian traditions held tightly by the older bosses, while younger, more restless members looked toward the brash, violent style they saw in New York's newer crews. Phil navigated both worlds. He understood the weight of tradition, formal sit-downs, respectful hierarchy, decisions made in whispers rather than shouts. But he also kept an eye on the changing tides. He spent more time than ever in Bruno's orbit, often acting as a bridge between the old guard and the more aggressive younger associates. It was a delicate role. Push too hard toward modern methods, and the old guard saw you as reckless. Cling too tightly to tradition, and the young guns saw you as outdated. Phil managed to make both sides feel heard without letting either side pull him too far off balance. One of his most critical roles was keeping peace in the numbers racket, which was always a source of friction. In some neighborhoods, younger crews were trying to muscle in on older operators, arguing that they could modernize collections and bring in more money. Phil's answer was always the same. You could bring in more money, yes, but if you did it in a way that stirred trouble, the costs would outweigh the profits. He'd been around long enough to know that mob wars rarely ended with anyone richer. It wasn't just the streets he was watching, it was Atlantic City. The legalization of casino gambling in 1976 changed everything. Suddenly, the Philadelphia mob wasn't just running backroom card games. They had a stake in a gold rush. Bruno saw opportunity, but also danger. Too many moving parts, too many new players. Phil helped manage the expansion cautiously, steering the family's involvement through union connections, construction deals, and supply contracts, rather than trying to run the casino floors directly. Around this time, a quiet test of loyalty came his way. A small crew from out of state offered him a share in an independent loan operation. High profit, quick turnaround, and no need to involve Bruno. Phil listened, nodded politely, and declined. The refusal didn't just keep him clean, it sent a message to anyone watching that he wasn't going to cut side deals behind the boss's back. In a world where betrayal was the currency of advancement, that kind of loyalty was rare. Many people still think that Phil's unwavering loyalty to Bruno was the only reason he survived the political storms that were brewing in the late 70s. But there's another angle. His loyalty wasn't blind. He knew that tying himself to Bruno meant tying himself to a stable system, one that had kept the Philadelphia mob from tearing itself apart for nearly 2 decades. So what do you think? Was that loyalty a virtue, or just a calculated survival tactic? Law enforcement pressure was mounting too. Federal prosecutors had begun targeting the Philadelphia family more aggressively, leaning on informants, using wiretaps, and building RICO cases. Phil adjusted. Meetings moved more often, conversations got shorter, and messages were delivered in person rather than by phone. The poultry shop remained his safe space, a place where an FBI agent could sit across the street for hours and see nothing more suspicious than a man selling fresh chicken. He also began grooming younger associates in his own image, teaching them how to keep calm, how to listen, how to avoid unnecessary enemies. Some listened. Others thought his style was too slow, too cautious for the changing times. Those were the ones he kept at arm's length. He knew that in the years ahead, the greatest threats to stability would come from inside, not outside. By the end of the decade, Phil Testa was more than a trusted underboss. He was the man many believed could step into Bruno's shoes if the time came. He wasn't campaigning for it, but he didn't need to. His reputation for loyalty, patience, and quiet efficiency had already made the case. The city might have known him as the Chicken Man, but within the family, they knew him as something else. The steady hand, waiting in the wings. By the close of the 1970s, the air in Philadelphia's underworld had grown heavier. Angelo Bruno's reign had been remarkably free of internal wars, but it wasn't immune to the quiet buildup of pressure. Men who'd once been content with steady profits were now looking across the river at the quick fortunes being made in New York and New Jersey. Phil Testa felt the shift like a change in barometric pressure. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. He had spent years building a reputation as a problem solver, the man who could smooth tensions before they exploded. But the whispers were getting harder to contain. Younger crews were restless, seeing the Atlantic City casino boom as their ticket to faster, flashier wealth. The old guard, still loyal to Bruno's cautious approach, saw that as a dangerous gamble. Phil stood between them, trying to keep the peace without giving ground to recklessness. His role often meant making unpopular decisions. When a crew under his influence tried to expand a numbers operation into a rival's territory, Phil shut it down. He didn't do it with threats. He simply called the crew's leader into the poultry shop, poured him a cup of coffee, and laid out exactly why pushing forward would cost more than it could ever earn. The man left grumbling, but he backed off. It was another quiet victory, though not one that earned him friends among the ambitious. Meanwhile, Atlantic City had become a magnet for every hustler in the tri-state area. Bruno's Philadelphia family had a foothold, but it was carefully measured. Phil had helped secure union leverage over construction and supply contracts, ensuring a steady stream of money without the heat of running games on the floor. Still, he could see the danger in the gold rush. Too many outsiders were circling. Too many locals were willing to make side deals. There's a story from this period about a meeting in a dim corner of a casino restaurant. A New York mob figure suggested to Phil that the Philadelphia family should take a bigger bite of the action. Phil smiled slightly and said, "Bigger bites can choke you." The line made the rounds afterward, not because it was flashy, but because it perfectly captured his philosophy. Many people still think that Phil's caution was a sign that he lacked the ambition to truly dominate Atlantic City. But others argue he understood something the hot-headed dreamers didn't, that rapid expansion without structure would invite not just rival crews, but federal attention. So what do you think? Was he protecting Bruno's empire, or just delaying the inevitable? His relationship with Bruno remained steady. They still met often, discussing the shifting landscape and the balance of power within the family. Bruno trusted Phil to handle delicate situations, particularly as tensions with certain factions, like those tied to Antonio Tony Banana's Caponegro, began to simmer. Phil knew Caponegro well enough to sense that beneath his politeness was a calculating ambition. The older man's eyes had the restless gleam of someone thinking 2 moves ahead, not always in ways that served the boss. Phil also noticed more FBI attention on his movements. The poultry shop was still his safe haven, but agents were no longer content to watch from across the street. They followed him to meetings, lingered outside restaurants, and occasionally tried to start conversations under false pretenses. He never bit. His answers were polite, but empty, his expression steady. He'd learned early that silence wasn't just golden, it was armor. In those final months of the decade, Phil was fully aware that a storm was forming. The only question was when it would break, and whether he'd be able to keep his balance when it did. For years, he had been the quiet anchor of stability in Bruno's world. But anchors can't stop a ship from rocking if the waves grow high enough. The first real cracks in the Philadelphia family's unity appeared not with gunfire, but with whispers. Inside smoky back rooms, voices dropped to low murmurs when certain names came up. Men who'd been loyal for decades now questioning whether Angelo Bruno's patient, measured style was keeping the family strong or holding it back. Phil Testa, always attuned to the undercurrents, heard those doubts long before they surfaced in any open defiance. He'd been around long enough to know that dissent in a crime family rarely came in the form of bold speeches. It was more like a slow leak, an offhand comment here, a suggestion there, a deal made without the usual permissions. The late 1970s were full of those leaks, and most of them led back to a few ambitious figures. Antonio Tony Bananas Caponegro was the most obvious. On the surface, Caponegro was polite and cooperative. Beneath it, Phil suspected, he was already sketching out his own plans for the top seat. The signs of change weren't just in the hierarchy, they were in the money. Younger members were getting restless about the way profits from Atlantic City were distributed. Some felt the New York families were taking too much. Others thought Bruno was too cautious, missing chances to expand. Phil understood both arguments, but saw the danger in acting on them recklessly. He'd seen too many men mistake short-term gains for long-term security. One evening at the poultry shop, an associate came in with an offer from a group of outsiders eager to run a high-stakes card room without cutting Bruno in. Phil listened, nodded, and asked how they planned to protect it. The man shrugged, saying they could work it out if anyone caused trouble. Phil leaned in slightly and said, "If you have to work it out after trouble starts, you've already lost." The meeting ended there. Many people still think Phil's role during this period was purely defensive, that he was simply shoring up Bruno's position against the brewing unrest. But there's another reading, that he was quietly testing loyalties, taking the measure of who might stay steady when things turned ugly. So, what do you think? Was he just protecting the status quo? Or was he preparing for what might come after? Street-level operations were also shifting. The loan shark business was steady, but required more vigilance. Federal pressure meant some collectors had to work slower, take smaller payments, and avoid the kind of brutality that drew headlines. Phil insisted on keeping collections quiet, favoring subtle reminders over public examples. It frustrated some, but it kept law enforcement from having easy wins. The gambling racket remained profitable, but territorial lines were blurring as younger crews crossed into established zones, claiming ignorance. Phil knew ignorance was rarely genuine. He called more sit-downs in those years than in any other period, trying to keep disputes from flaring into full feuds. His style was the same. Low voice, deliberate pace, never rushing to fill a silence. That stillness could make men rethink their positions before he ever had to issue an ultimatum. All the while, the FBI's presence grew. Unmarked sedans idled near known meeting spots. Agents in cheap suits lingered on corners. Wiretap rumors circulated, and Phil advised anyone who'd listen to assume every phone was compromised. He'd already switched to face-to-face for anything of value, preferring walks through crowded streets to the confines of a single room. By 1980, the feeling in the Philadelphia mob was less like a family and more like a table where too many people wanted the biggest slice. Phil Testa knew that sooner or later, someone would decide the only way to get it was to upend the whole table. And when that happened, survival wouldn't be about who had the most muscle. It would be about who had the clearest head. March 21st, 1980, was the day everything shifted. Angelo Bruno, the man who had kept Philadelphia's mob steady for 2 decades, was shot dead while sitting in his car outside his home. The hit was clean, quiet, and devastating, not just for the family's structure, but for the delicate balance Phil Testa had spent years helping to maintain. News traveled fast in South Philly. By sunrise the next morning, the corner cafes were buzzing, the payphones were jammed, and everyone was repeating the same question: who ordered it? Phil heard the whispers before the police even made their first public statement. The name Tony Bananas Caponegro floated through the air like cigarette smoke, thick, lingering, and hard to ignore. For Phil, Bruno's death wasn't just the loss of a friend and mentor, it was the collapse of a way of doing business. Bruno's style had been patient, almost diplomatic, and it had kept Philadelphia from descending into the kind of chaos that plagued other cities. Without him, the city's underworld suddenly felt like a chessboard where half the pieces were moving without rules. In the hours after the murder, Phil moved carefully. He didn't make public statements, didn't rush to stake claims. Instead, he met privately with men he trusted, quietly gauging their loyalties. He knew that in the aftermath of a hit like this, the first moves were often the most dangerous. Anyone too eager to seize power risked drawing both suspicion and retaliation. The funeral was a spectacle of both grief and theater. Law enforcement, journalists, and rival crews all watched who stood where, who spoke to whom, who avoided whose gaze. Phil kept his place near the front, paying his respects without drawing attention. It was a show of loyalty, but also of restraint. He didn't need to announce his intentions. People could see he was still in the game. Many people still think Phil's calm demeanor in those days meant he wasn't interested in leading. But those who knew him better understood it was the opposite. He was letting the dust settle, knowing that whoever moved too quickly would be the first target. So what do you think? Was his patient strategy or hesitation? The fallout was swift and brutal. The commission in New York, the governing body of the American mafia, was furious about Bruno's unsanctioned murder. Caponegro and his co-conspirators were found dead within weeks, their bodies left in ways that made the message clear. There were rules, and breaking them came at a price. With Caponegro gone and the family suddenly leaderless, the question of succession landed squarely on the table. Phil Testa, long respected for his loyalty to Bruno and his ability to keep the peace, emerged as the natural choice. He wasn't the loudest candidate, but in a climate where everyone was nervous about another reckless move, his steady hand was exactly what some factions wanted. The commission approved him as the new boss of the Philadelphia family. It was a role he accepted without fanfare, stepping into Bruno's shadowed seat with the understanding that it came with both authority and a bullseye. The quiet problem solver was now the man everyone would be watching. Friends, rivals, and law enforcement alike. In those first weeks, Phil focused on restoring stability. He reaffirmed alliances, made small concessions where needed, and made it clear that reckless ambition wouldn't be tolerated. But even as he worked to steady the ship, he could feel the waves already building. Bruno had ruled for 2 decades. Phil knew his own reign might be measured in months. Phil Testa stepped into the power vacuum left by Bruno with the kind of quiet confidence that had defined his entire career. There were no grand speeches, no sudden purges, just a steady series of meetings in restaurants, union halls, and back rooms, each designed to send the same message. The Philadelphia family would remain united, and business would go on. His first priority was calming the internal turbulence. Bruno's murder had left scars, and even with Caponegro gone, suspicion lingered. Phil reached out to the older capos first, reinforcing the traditions Bruno had upheld: respect for hierarchy, discipline in business, and keeping disputes internal. Those conversations were short but meaningful. They reminded the old guard that the man now in charge had been one of their own for decades. The younger crews required a different touch. Some saw Bruno's death as a sign that the old rules were weakening, that maybe the time had come to grab more territory, more rackets, more everything. Phil met with them quietly, often one-on-one, making it clear that expansion was possible, but only through him. He wasn't against ambition, but he refused to let it fracture the family. He also made an early move to solidify his support by elevating Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo to consigliere. Scarfo, volatile and feared, was a stark contrast to Phil's calm. Many people still think this pairing was a mistake, arguing that Scarfo's ruthless style clashed with Phil's diplomacy. But another view is that Phil saw Scarfo as a necessary counterbalance, a sword in reserve, ready if talks failed. So what do you think? Was it strategic foresight or a dangerous gamble? Beyond managing personalities, Phil focused on securing the family's revenue streams. The Atlantic City casinos remained a priority, but he also looked to shore up the traditional rackets: numbers, sports betting, loan sharking, and union influence. These were the foundations that had kept the family strong under Bruno, and Phil wasn't about to let them weaken. In the months after his rise, he restored a sense of order. Disputes were handled quickly, meetings ran without interruption, and money flowed steadily upward. It wasn't the kind of leadership that made headlines, but it worked. Law enforcement, of course, noticed the shift and stepped up surveillance, but Phil's low profile gave them little to work with. There's a story from this period about a meeting between Phil and a mid-level capo who'd been skimming from his gambling operation. Instead of making an example of him, Phil laid out exactly how much money had gone missing, how easily it could be traced, and how fast it could become a problem for both of them. The capo returned every dollar and never skimmed again. It was pure Testa, control through quiet, undeniable pressure. By the end of 1980, it seemed possible that Phil might actually hold the family together through the post-Bruno turbulence. But beneath the surface, old resentments hadn't disappeared. They'd only gone quiet. And in the mob, quiet could be more dangerous than open hostility, because it meant people were thinking, planning, and waiting. Phil knew it. He could feel it in the way certain conversations trailed off when he entered a room, in the sidelong glances exchanged between men who once spoke freely in his presence. The job now wasn't just running the family, it was surviving it. Phil Testa's first winter as boss carried an odd mix of calm and tension. On the surface, the Philadelphia family was stable again. Money was flowing, disputes were minimal, and the older capos seemed content with his leadership. But anyone with a sense for mob politics could feel the undercurrent. Stability in this life was often just the quiet before a shift no one wanted to acknowledge. Phil handled his business the same way he always had, steadily, with deliberate movements. Meetings were shorter, less frequent, and held in rotating locations to keep law enforcement guessing. The poultry shop was still in use, though more as a symbolic anchor than a true headquarters. Some days, he would actually work the counter for a few hours, greeting neighbors, taking orders, even chatting with old customers about family and weather. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was a way of telling anyone watching that the chicken man hadn't forgotten where he came from. Behind the scenes, though, his workload had doubled. The Atlantic City casinos were proving to be both a blessing and a curse. The profits were substantial, but the competition was intense, with New York families eyeing the same pie. Phil kept his focus on indirect control, union contracts, supply chains, and vendor agreements. These were harder for outsiders to muscle into, and they kept the money flowing without drawing as much heat. His relationship with Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, was, at this stage, cooperative. Scarfo's aggressive style made him an effective enforcer, and Phil used him selectively, sending him in only when diplomacy had no chance of success. Scarfo liked the latitude Phil gave him, but some in the family saw the pairing as unstable. Two men with such different temperaments often found their methods clashing in the long run. One example came when a small crew delayed payment from a profitable loan shark operation. Scarfo wanted to send a physical message. Phil disagreed. Instead, he arranged a sit-down, laid out the math on exactly how much money was at risk, and gave the crew a week to correct the shortfall. They paid in full within 3 days. Scarfo got results his way too, but Phil's method left no bruises, no heat, and no grudges. Many people still think this difference in approach was the seed of tension between them. So what do you think? Was Phil keeping Scarfo in check? Or was Scarfo letting his resentment quietly build? Federal attention remained constant. The FBI had wiretaps on suspected meeting spots, surveillance teams shadowing high-profile members, and informants fishing for incriminating conversations. Phil's discipline made him a frustrating target. Agents often left empty-handed, forced to write reports about mundane exchanges over coffee and poultry orders. Still, he wasn't blind to the danger. He'd seen too many bosses fall not from bullets, but from indictments. He began keeping more distance between himself and certain operations, delegating details to trusted lieutenants. The fewer direct connections law enforcement could prove, the better. By early 1981, Phil had managed something rare. he had kept the Philadelphia family profitable and largely peaceful in the immediate aftermath of a high-profile mob assassination. But he also knew he was walking a razor's edge. The men who smiled at him today could be planning something different tomorrow. In this life, trust was a currency with a short expiration date. By February 1981, Phil Testa's reign had lasted just under a year, a short span by the standards of old-school bosses, but long enough for the shifting loyalties beneath him to become clearer. Outwardly, the Philadelphia family was still running smoothly. The numbers racket, loan sharking, and union influence remained steady, and Atlantic City contracts kept the cash flowing. But behind closed doors, there was unease. Part of the tension came from the mix of personalities within his top circle. Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo, was still consigliere, but his ambitions were no secret. Scarfo thrived on fear and spectacle. Phil preferred patience and subtlety. The difference in style didn't cause open conflict yet, but it left some men wondering whose influence would shape the future. Phil's leadership style remained consistent. He avoided rash moves, preferred negotiation over intimidation, and worked to prevent small disputes from becoming full feuds. But that same style, admired by the old guard, was starting to frustrate the younger faction. They wanted more aggressive expansion, especially in Atlantic City, where other families were grabbing larger shares. Phil reminded them that reckless grabs invited heat from both law enforcement and rival crews. Many people still think this was the smartest possible stance at the time, but others claim it made him look hesitant. So what do you think? Was he protecting the family's stability or missing a chance to dominate? One meeting in early '81 illustrates his approach. A construction union boss hinted at a side deal with an out-of-town crew that could have tripled their skim. Phil listened, nodded, and then quietly outlined exactly how the deal would fall apart under scrutiny, dragging everyone into federal court. The union boss backed down. Scarfo later told associates that Testa was too cautious for his own good. The law was still watching closely. FBI reports noted Phil's movements, but found little actionable. Agents had come to expect that meetings in the poultry shop would be interrupted by customers or neighborhood regulars, making it nearly impossible to catch him speaking freely. Phil didn't mind the interruptions. They reinforced his image as a working man first, a boss second. Yet even in his measured control, he could feel the shift. Certain capos who once checked in regularly now sent messages through intermediaries. A few associates were spending more time in Atlantic City without looping him in on the details. These were small signs, but Phil knew better than to ignore them. In his quieter moments, he must have remembered the lessons from his early days, how quickly loyalty could turn, how ambition could grow in the dark. He had risen to the top without ever making a reckless move. Now, the challenge was holding that position in a family where patience wasn't everyone's game. By the end of February, the air around him felt heavier. He could still walk into a room and command respect, but respect in the mob was like fresh bread. It didn't last long without constant tending. And while Phil was tending to the family's stability, someone else might already have been preparing to take it all away. March 1981 began with the kind of gray, heavy skies that seemed to press the city down. For Phil Testa, the month opened with small victories, settling a dispute over a union contract, smoothing over tensions between two gambling crews, but the air still carried that low hum of unease he'd been sensing for weeks. In the mob, intuition wasn't a luxury. It was survival, and Phil's instincts told him the ground beneath his feet was shifting. The signs weren't dramatic. They were in the little things. Certain associates avoiding eye contact, conversations cutting off when he entered a room, and Scarfo being just a little too quiet during meetings. Phil had been in this life long enough to know that silence often carried sharper edges than open disagreement. Atlantic City was still a source of both profit and strain. The casino boom had changed the game entirely, drawing in not just Philadelphia crews, but outside operators who saw opportunity in the neon lights and late-night cash flow. Phil's position was still one of controlled expansion, keeping operations tied to union leverage, construction, and supply contracts rather than direct casino floors. It kept things clean, but some in the family wanted more, wanted the quick, risky scores that came with higher heat. One evening in early March, Phil met with a small group of capos at a quiet restaurant in South Philly. The talk circled back to Atlantic City, and again he made the case for steady growth over grabbing too much too fast. He used the same line he'd told outsiders before. "Bigger bites can choke you." They nodded, but the look in their eyes wasn't agreement. It was calculation. Many people still think this was the meeting where a decision was made to remove him. So what do you think? Was it his caution that doomed him? Or was the decision already in motion no matter what he said? Outside, pressures were also tightening. The FBI had stepped up its monitoring, leaning on informants and building cases. Phil knew that any big move now could tip the balance toward indictments, and his cautious style was partly about protecting the family from that fate. But in the underworld, men who weren't chasing every possible dollar were often seen as holding others back. Scarfo's role in this period remains a subject of debate among mob historians. Publicly, he was still Phil's consigliere, the man brought in when force was necessary. Privately, some believe he was cultivating his own network, preparing for a moment when he could take the top seat himself. Phil, ever the careful reader of people, must have sensed Scarfo's ambitions, but whether he underestimated them or simply believed loyalty would hold is something no one can answer for certain. The weeks leading up to mid-March carried a strange calm, the kind that feels too deliberate. Phil went about his business, making his rounds, checking in with crews, and keeping the books balanced. But even he might have known that calm in the mob often comes just before the blast. March 15th, 1981, began like any other Sunday in South Philadelphia. Quiet streets, the smell of bread drifting from bakeries, neighbors exchanging nods as they walked to church. Phil Testa's morning followed its usual rhythm. He stopped by the poultry shop briefly, checked in with a couple of associates, and returned to his home on Porter Street. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary day. But in the world he lived in, ordinary could vanish in an instant. It was just before 10 a.m. when Phil stepped onto his front porch. The air was cool, damp from an early drizzle. In that moment, the trap was already set. A package, disguised to look like it had been delivered to his door, sat waiting. Inside was a bomb, wired and timed for when the first hand disturbed it. As Phil bent toward the package, the device detonated. The explosion shattered the calm of the block, blowing out windows, splintering wood, and sending smoke curling into the gray sky. Neighbors rushed to their doors in shock. In seconds, the man who had spent decades navigating the shadows of Philadelphia's underworld was gone. The news raced through the city. By midday, every corner cafe and bar was buzzing with the same stunned question. Who had the nerve to kill the chicken man? Many people still think the order came from within his own family, driven by ambition and resentment over his cautious leadership. Others believe outside forces played a role, seeing opportunity in removing a stabilizing figure. So what do you think? Was it purely an internal betrayal, or something more tangled? Law enforcement swarmed the scene, but the blast had done its work too well. Evidence was scarce, and the code of silence in South Philly remained unbroken. For the FBI, it was another case of knowing who might have been involved, but lacking the proof to make charges stick. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. Without Phil's steady hand, the Philadelphia family entered a period of rapid, violent change. Nicodemo Scarfo moved quickly to consolidate power, ushering in a new era defined by open intimidation and bloodshed. The contrast to Phil's short, measured reign could not have been sharper. For the neighbors who had known him since he was the quiet boy in the poultry shop, the bombing was more than just a mob hit. It was a rupture in the fabric of the community. The Chicken Man had been many things: a father, a friend, a businessman, and a boss. His death left a hole in South Philly that couldn't be patched over with fear or money. As the smoke cleared and the city returned to its uneasy rhythm, one truth lingered. In the life Phil had chosen, even the most patient and careful player could only avoid the blast for so long. In the hours after the bombing, South Philadelphia was a strange blend of noise and silence. Sirens had long faded, replaced by the low murmur of neighbors speaking in doorways, the shuffle of police tape in the wind, and the distant hum of traffic that seemed oddly out of place. The shock hadn't worn off, but the city's underworld was already in motion. In that world, a power vacuum never stayed empty for long. Phil Testa's assassination wasn't just the removal of a boss. It was the collapse of a certain style of leadership. He had ruled with restraint, making quiet deals, choosing negotiation over force. That approach had kept the family stable, but it had also frustrated the men who measured strength by fear and body counts. Now, with Phil gone, those men saw their chance. Nicodemo, Little Nicky. Scarfo moved with calculated speed. Within days, he began consolidating support, positioning himself as the natural successor. Scarfo had long been underestimated by some, dismissed as a volatile enforcer better suited to muscle than management. But behind the reputation was an ambition that had been simmering for years. Phil's death gave him the opening he needed. The older capos, still reeling from the blast, were faced with a choice: back Scarfo or risk being swept aside. Many had respected Phil for his diplomacy, but few were willing to fight to preserve that style of leadership in the face of Scarfo's aggressive rise. Some believed Scarfo would at least keep the money flowing. Others simply feared the consequences of standing in his way. Meanwhile, on the streets, the reaction to Phil's death was mixed. In the neighborhood, shopkeepers and residents spoke of him with a kind of guarded fondness, remembering the man who had kept the poultry shop open, who knew their names and asked after their families. In the rackets, some saw his end as proof that caution could be a weakness in a world that rewarded ruthlessness. Many people still think that if Phil had moved more aggressively against potential rivals, he might have survived. Others believe his fate was sealed the moment he took the top seat after Bruno. So, what do you think? Was he doomed by the position itself, or by the way he chose to hold it? Law enforcement treated the bombing as a statement killing, one meant to shock as much as to eliminate. The FBI increased its presence in South Philly, hoping the upheaval might shake loose informants or expose fault lines. But the code of silence held, and while agents had their suspicions, no one came forward with proof. In the weeks that followed, Scarfo's rise was complete. He installed his own loyalists in key positions, reshaped the family's approach to business, and made it clear that his reign would be nothing like Phil's. The Chicken Man's short tenure as boss was over, replaced by an era that would become one of the most violent in Philadelphia's mob history. For those who had known Phil personally, there was an unspoken understanding that something had been lost beyond the man himself. His way of doing business, measured, deliberate, and rooted in an old world sense of order, had died with him on that porch. What followed would be louder, bloodier, and far less forgiving. Scarfo's ascension after Phil Testa's murder was swift, almost unnervingly so. Within weeks, the Philadelphia family's structure shifted. Men who had once been loyal to Phil either pledged themselves to Scarfo or quietly stepped aside, sensing that the new boss had little patience for those he considered lukewarm allies. Scarfo rewarded his supporters with lucrative rackets and gave them more latitude to operate, so long as they understood that all roads now led through him. The contrast in leadership styles was impossible to miss. Phil had favored diplomacy, smoothing conflicts before they escalated. Scarfo thrived on intimidation, using sudden, decisive shows of force to remind everyone of his reach. Where Phil might have called a meeting to settle a dispute, Scarfo sent a message, sometimes in the form of a beating, sometimes worse. The shift was jarring for those who had grown accustomed to the quieter, more predictable Bruno Testa years. Still, Scarfo was shrewd enough to know that not everyone in the family had been pleased with Phil's cautious approach. Some saw Scarfo's aggression as a correction, a return to the kind of dominance that could keep rivals in check. Others recognized it for what it was, a leadership style that would invite both internal resentment and external heat. In the neighborhood, the legacy of the Chicken Man remained complicated. On the one hand, people remembered his steady demeanor, the way he kept the peace when hotheads could have ignited street wars. On the other, there were whispers that his refusal to push harder, to seize more of Atlantic City and expand faster, had created openings for those eager to replace him. Many people still think Phil might have extended his reign if he'd matched caution with a show of decisive power. But just as many believe he was never the type to rule that way, and that trying would have been against his nature. So what do you think? Should a boss bend to the times, or hold to the principles that brought him to power? Law enforcement didn't mourn the shift. Scarfo's more conspicuous style made him an easier target. Agents who had been frustrated by Phil's discretion suddenly found themselves tracking a man whose operations were larger, louder, and far more prone to generating informants. But even as the FBI recalibrated, there was an acknowledgement among some investigators that Testa's death had marked the end of a rare period of relative calm in the Philadelphia mob. Among the older generation, Phil's short reign became a point of bittersweet reflection. He had been a bridge between eras, the link between Bruno's diplomacy and Scarfo's brutality. That bridge had been blown apart on a quiet Sunday morning, and in its place was a road leading toward open conflict. For the men who had worked closely with him, the lesson was clear. In the mob, survival wasn't just about avoiding your enemies. It was about surviving your friends. In the months after Phil Testa's death, the Philadelphia underworld adjusted quickly to Scarfo's new regime. But the shift left a noticeable void in how business was conducted. Under Phil, disputes had been channeled through quiet conversations, often resolved before they could spill into violence. Now, tensions were more likely to end with someone in the hospital, or worse. The fear Scarfo inspired kept people in line, but But it also bred paranoia, even among his closest associates. For those who had operated under Phil, the adjustment was jarring. Crews accustomed to measured decisions suddenly found themselves working under a boss who expected immediate action. Scarfo's impatience meant that even minor infractions could bring heavy consequences. Some men who had flourished under Phil's steady leadership found themselves sidelined, while others, especially those willing to use force, were promoted. In the neighborhood, the contrast in leadership styles was the subject of quiet conversations over coffee. Older residents remembered Phil as a man who would stop to talk, who seemed more invested in maintaining community ties than projecting power through fear. Now, the presence of the mob felt colder, more transactional. One shopkeeper summed it up bluntly. With the chicken man, you knew where you stood. With Scarfo, you hope you're standing in the right place. Law enforcement noticed the change too. FBI reports from the period note an uptick in violent incidents tied to the Philadelphia family. Surveillance teams who had once trailed Phil through quiet meetings in cafes now found themselves documenting confrontations, intimidation tactics, and sudden disappearances. Many people still think this shift made the family more vulnerable to infiltration. When men fear their own boss as much as the law, loyalty starts to crack. So, what do you think? Did Scarfo's rule make the family stronger in the short term, but weaker in the long run? Phil's legacy, meanwhile, took on a different shape as time passed. Among the old guard, he was remembered as the last bridge to Bruno's style of leadership. Among younger, more aggressive operators, he became an example of what not to do if you wanted to hold power in volatile times. Neither view told the full story. Phil's caution had kept the family stable during a dangerous transition, but it had also left him exposed to those who valued speed over stability. His family kept a low profile in the aftermath, retreating from the public eye. Those who had known him personally kept their memories close. Stories of the man in the poultry shop, the quiet voice that could settle a dispute without raising a hand. In the mob, such memories were rare and fragile, often overshadowed by the louder legacies of violence. By late 1981, the city's underworld had fully moved on from the era of the Chicken Man. But in certain corners of South Philly, his name still carried a weight that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the idea that power didn't always have to roar. As Scarfo's reign deepened through late 1981, the Philadelphia family's methods hardened. The careful diplomacy that had marked Phil Testa's short leadership was replaced by a tempo of aggression. Disputes were no longer mediated, they were ended, sometimes in a back room, sometimes in the street. The tone of the organization had changed so completely that to some, it felt like an entirely different family. For the men who had been close to Phil, survival meant adapting. Some shifted their operations to align more closely with Scarfo's demands, even if it meant abandoning the slower, steadier methods they'd learned under the Chicken Man. Others withdrew into quieter rackets, limiting their exposure to the volatile new boss. And there were those who simply disappeared from the scene, taking their skills and connections with them, rather than risk becoming collateral damage in Scarfo's ambitions. Phil's absence was felt most in the way conflicts escalated. Under him, a brewing feud might have been cooled with a handshake and a redistribution of territory. Now, those same disputes were settled with bullets or bomb threats. It was a more dramatic style, but it brought with it more attention from law enforcement and more bodies for the papers to write about. In South Philly itself, the shift was visible even to those far outside mob life. Scarfo's men were more conspicuous: expensive suits, louder cars, and a willingness to be seen throwing their weight around. Phil had preferred to blend in, letting the poultry shop be his unofficial headquarters. With Scarfo, the message was clear. The family was present, and you'd better remember it. Many people still think this visible, fear-driven style eroded the old trust between the mob and the neighborhood. Under Phil, there had been an unspoken understanding. He kept the peace, and in return, people looked the other way about his business. Scarfo's approach demanded respect through intimidation, but respect born of fear rarely lasts without resistance. So what do you think? Does fear keep order, or does it just breed rebellion in the shadows? Within law enforcement, there was almost a grudging acknowledgement that Phil had been the harder man to pin down. Agents knew Scarfo's volatility would eventually create openings for indictments. But for those who had studied the Bruno and Testa years, there was a recognition that the stability of that era, though criminal, had kept the streets quieter than they would be under the new regime. By the end of 1981, the Chicken Man's name was already fading from headlines, replaced by the violence and spectacle of Scarfo's rise. But among the people who had seen him work, who had watched him run a family without drowning it in blood, his memory carried a different kind of weight. It was the weight of knowing that, for a brief time, South Philadelphia had been run by a man who believed power didn't always need to explode. It could also whisper. The feud with Harry. The Hunchback. Ricobane's faction had been simmering even before Phil Testa's death. But under his leadership, it never erupted into full-scale war. Phil had approached Ricoban with the same careful diplomacy he used for other disputes. Quiet meetings, offers of compromise, and a clear message that stability benefited everyone. It didn't erase the tension, but it kept it contained. After the bombing that took his life, that containment was gone. Scarfo's rise brought a very different posture toward Ricoban's crew, one of confrontation rather than conciliation. Almost immediately, the fragile threads Phil had woven began to snap. Ricobene, long at odds with Scarfo's allies, saw no reason to bend now. The result was a feud that spilled into the streets in a way Phil had worked hard to prevent. Looking back, many people still think Phil's approach to Ricobene was one of his sharpest tactical moves. He understood that not every rival had to be crushed. Sometimes it was enough to keep them close, monitored, and manageable. Scarfo's aggressive stance removed that buffer, turning a manageable rivalry into an open wound. So what do you think? Was Phil's diplomacy buying time? Or was it the only way to keep that particular peace? During Phil's tenure, the Ricobene dispute had centered on territory, particularly in lucrative parts of South Philly and certain union rackets. Phil's tactic was to offer small concessions in exchange for predictable boundaries. He wasn't afraid to enforce the line when necessary, but he preferred to do so without drawing attention. This kept law enforcement from focusing too heavily on the rift, and it allowed both sides to continue making money without constant interference. One associate recalled a meeting in which Ricoben hinted at expanding into a contested area. Phil didn't threaten or bluster. He simply asked how much business Harry was willing to lose if things went bad. The point was made without a single raised voice. The expansion never happened. Phil's death meant that the kind of personal trust and mutual understanding he had with Riccobene vanished overnight. Scarfo, seeing any sign of autonomy as a threat, moved quickly to push Harry out entirely. In doing so, he triggered the very street-level violence that Phil had spent years trying to avoid. In the broader story of Philadelphia's mob history, the Rickabine feud stands as a dividing line between two eras: the restrained, negotiated stability of the Bruno and Testa years, and the blood-soaked volatility of Scarfo's rule. Phil's ability to keep that feud in check, even for a short time, was a testament to his skill as a mediator in a world that rarely valued patience. For the men who had been there during both reigns, the difference was stark. Under Phil, disputes had a chance to be solved in back rooms. Under Scarfo, they too often ended in morgues. The hit that took Phil Testa's life had been quick and decisive, but the plotting behind it had been anything but sudden. In the months leading up to that March morning, quiet moves were being made. Relationships tested, alliances reshaped, and subtle shifts in loyalty that Phil, despite his instincts, couldn't fully stop. Forensic investigators never publicly named the hands that built the bomb, but on the streets, theories hardened fast. The most common belief was that the order came from inside his own family, from men who saw his cautious style as an obstacle to more aggressive profits. Scarfo's rapid rise afterward only deepened suspicions. Others whispered of external players, ambitious figures from New York or New Jersey who stood to gain by removing a stabilizing figure in Philadelphia. Many people still think the truth was a mix of both. Outside encouragement matched with inside willingness. So what do you think? Was it purely a coup from within, or the result of a larger chess game? Phil's own habits may have played a role. His routines were deliberate, designed to keep him in control of his movements and his surroundings. But routine can also make a man predictable. Those who wanted him gone knew where he lived when he stepped outside, and how rarely he traveled with heavy protection. It wasn't that he underestimated danger. He had simply lived for so long with a certain rhythm that changing it might have felt like an admission of fear. The most striking detail of the assassination was its method. A bomb, left like a delivery, detonated at the threshold of his own home. It sent a message that even the careful could be reached. Unlike a shooting, it didn't require the killer to be present in the moment. It was impersonal, surgical, and meant to shock as much as to kill. Law enforcement descended on Porter Street, collecting fragments and interviewing neighbors, but the code of silence held fast. FBI files from the period note how quickly the street went quiet after the blast, as if everyone understood that talking would only make the ground under them more unstable. In the days that followed, Phil's closest associates moved with caution, unsure of where loyalties truly lay. Some of them later admitted that the speed with which Scarfo consolidated power made it clear the groundwork had been in place well before the explosion. Phil had spent his career believing that patience and measured moves could keep a man in the game longer than brute force. His death was the brutal counter-argument. In the Philadelphia of 1981, patience might still be a virtue, but only for those who had the muscle to protect it. The blast on Porter Street didn't just end Phil Testa's life. It ripped through the fragile balance of Philadelphia's underworld, like a fault line snapping under pressure. Within hours, the structure he had tried to maintain was bending toward a new center of gravity. Men who had once sworn loyalty to him began shifting their allegiances, some out of ambition, others simply to survive. Nicodemo, Little Nicky. Scarfo moved with calculated precision. Even before Phil's funeral, Scarfo was meeting quietly with key capos, securing promises, offering positions, and making it clear that resistance would be short-lived and costly. Phil's death had removed the last figure in the family who could temper Scarfo's more volatile impulses. Now, there was no one left to stand between him and absolute control. The neighborhood reacted in its own way. In South Philly, the bombing was a shock to the senses, not just because it killed a mob boss, but because of where and how it happened. People who had grown used to mob business being conducted in the shadows were rattled by the idea that such violence could erupt in front of a family home on a quiet Sunday morning. Conversations in cafes turned hushed, not out of respect, but out of fear. If the chicken man could be reached here, anyone could. Law enforcement recognized the symbolism immediately. The use of a bomb was a departure from the family's usual methods and a signal that the internal rules were changing. FBI agents, who had long struggled to gather direct evidence against Phil, now shifted their focus to Scarfo, aware that his style would likely generate more openings for investigation. Many people still think the bombing was a direct message to anyone in the mob who believed caution and negotiation could still protect them. Others see it as the first shot in a new era, one where displays of power would be louder, bloodier, and far more public. So what do you think? Was the killing of Phil Testa meant to settle one score, or to redefine the rules entirely? In the weeks after the funeral, Scarfo solidified his hold. He reshuffled the family's leadership, rewarding those who had backed him early and sidelining anyone who hesitated. Rackets once handled with quiet discretion under Phil became more aggressive, pushing into new territories and tightening control over existing ones. The old ways, measured expansion, careful diplomacy, were gone. For those who had known Phil personally, the hardest part wasn't just the violence of his end, but the speed with which his approach was erased. The chicken man had believed in a kind of order, flawed though it was. Scarfo believed in dominance at any cost, and from that March morning forward, Philadelphia would feel the difference. In the months after the bombing, the Philadelphia mob's internal order unraveled faster than anyone outside the life could fully track. Phil Testa's quiet diplomacy had kept dozens of small rivalries in check, rivalries that Scarfo now approached with open force. The shift wasn't gradual, it was immediate, and it left no space for the kind of negotiation Phil had practiced. Scarfo's rise brought swift retribution against anyone who had hesitated to back him. Some men disappeared without explanation. Others found themselves stripped of lucrative rackets and pushed to the fringes. Even long-standing figures who had worked comfortably under Bruno and Testa discovered that the rules had changed. Loyalty was no longer measured in years of service, but in how quickly you proved your usefulness to the new boss. In the neighborhood, the atmosphere grew tense. Under Phil, the mob's presence was more subtle, felt rather than flaunted. Now, Scarfo's men moved in louder cars, with flashier clothes, and a willingness to make their power visible. For shopkeepers and residents, it wasn't just unsettling, it broke an unspoken pact. The chicken man had been part of the community, a figure who could walk the same streets without disrupting their rhythm. Scarfo's crew felt like an occupying force. Law enforcement's files from this period note a sharp increase in violent incidents, shootings, assaults, and bomb threats tied to organized crime. The visibility of these events brought heavier federal scrutiny, which in turn bred more paranoia inside the family. Many people still think that if Phil had survived, the family might have avoided the spiral of violence that followed. Others argue that the pressure from Atlantic City's profits and internal ambition meant a clash was inevitable. So what do you think? Was Scarfo's bloody era the product of one man's will, or the outcome of forces already set in motion? Phil's surviving family stayed out of the public eye, quietly stepping away from the street life. Friends and relatives kept his memory alive in private conversations, often focusing on the years when the poultry shop doubled as a community hub, a place where you could get both Sunday dinner and, if you were in the life, a word of advice. But inside the mob, his name was rarely spoken after Scarfo took control. It wasn't that he was forgotten. Rather, his style was a reminder of an approach that no longer fit the times. The Philadelphia family had entered a different chapter, and the era of the chicken man became something men spoke of only when they wanted to remember a calmer, quieter way of doing business. Scarfo's consolidation of power in late 1981 and into 1982 turned the Philadelphia family into something almost unrecognizable from the days of Bruno and Testa. Under Phil, alliances had been maintained like a delicate balance. Small concessions here, a quiet warning there, designed to keep the family's various crews profitable without crossing into constant bloodshed. Now, the gears turned differently. Scarfo valued control over cohesion, and fear became the currency he traded in most often. For those who had been close to Phil, the difference was stark. Meetings once held in quiet cafes or the back of the poultry shop were replaced by gatherings in more fortified locations, where the air was heavier with suspicion than camaraderie. Men watched what they said, not because of federal bugs, but because of who else was in the room. A careless word could be repeated to the wrong ears, and under Scarfo, a single rumor could be enough to seal a man's fate. The shift also reshaped the family's business. Rackets that Phil had kept deliberately small to avoid heat were now being pushed for maximum profit, regardless of attention. Union influence was leveraged more aggressively. Gambling territories were expanded into contested zones, and loan shark collections were enforced with a brutality that often drew headlines. It brought in more money, but it also drew the kind of federal focus that had been kept at bay during Phil's tenure. In South Philly, the community's relationship with the mob frayed, where Phil had been a visible but approachable figure. Someone you might see chatting with an old neighbor, Scarfo's men were distant, armored in a mix of arrogance and menace. The subtle, almost neighborly order that had existed under the chicken man gave way to a colder kind of authority. Many people still think that this loss of community connection was one of the most damaging shifts of Scarfo's rule. So what do you think? Can a criminal empire survive without some form of goodwill, or does fear alone keep it standing? Law enforcement, ironically, found itself missing Phil's brand of leadership. His predictability and preference for discretion made for fewer public incidents, and fewer public incidents meant less pressure from political leaders to clean up the streets. Scarfo's Philadelphia, by contrast, provided steady headlines and political talking points, forcing the FBI and local police into a more aggressive stance. Within the mob, Phil's legacy had already begun to fade into the background noise of survival. But for the men who had known him, there remained a quiet understanding that his approach, careful, patient, and rooted in a kind of understated respect, had been the last version of leadership that kept both the streets and the family from boiling over. That version was gone now, replaced by something louder, bloodier, and far more fragile. Phil Testa's legacy lingered in South Philadelphia long after the smoke from the March 1981 bombing had cleared. But it lingered in whispers, not in open conversation. Among the people who had grown up alongside him, there was a sense that his short time as boss had been an attempt, perhaps a last attempt, to keep the city's underworld operating under a code that valued stability over spectacle. In the mob, stability doesn't make headlines, but it can keep men alive. Those who remembered him in the poultry shop told stories of the way he could stand behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, chatting with a neighbor while simultaneously clocking every detail of who walked past the window. He was present in the neighborhood in a way few bosses were, rooted in it, as much a part of the streets as the brick row houses and the corner bakeries. That visibility made him approachable to some and underestimated by others. Inside the life, his leadership was defined by careful moves, the deliberate avoidance of unnecessary conflict, and a belief that everyone, capos, soldiers, even rivals, could be managed if you gave them just enough to keep them satisfied. It wasn't a style suited for the restless ambition that gripped parts of the Philadelphia family in the late 1970s and early 80s, but for a time, it kept the gears turning without grinding. Many people still think that Phil's measured approach would never have survived the era's growing appetite for quick money and bold moves. Others argue he was exactly the kind of leader the family needed to navigate the chaos of the post-Bruno years, and that his murder sealed the city's fate for the bloody decade that followed. So what do you think? Was the Chicken Man out of time? Or was he taken out precisely because his time wasn't finished? In the years after his death, Scarfo's reign made the difference painfully clear. Violence became the norm. Fear replaced respect, and the family's internal trust, what little there had been, crumbled under the weight of paranoia. Those who had lived through both eras spoke of Phil's time in charge as a brief calm between storms. History rarely spares much ink for leaders who avoid drama, and Phil Testa's tenure as boss lasted barely a year. But in that year, he demonstrated that power could be exercised without constant bloodshed, that order could be maintained without burning the city around you. In the brutal arithmetic of mob life, it wasn't enough to keep him alive, but it left a quiet imprint on the people who saw it firsthand. And so, as the story of the Chicken Man fades into the larger, louder history of Philadelphia's mob, we're left with the image of a man standing on a South Philly porch in the cool morning air, seconds before a blast rewrote the future. His life was full of contradictions, a man tied to crime, yet respected for his fairness, cautious yet bold enough to step into the role of boss during one of the city's most precarious moments. If you walk those same streets now, you won't see the poultry shop, and you won't hear his voice over the hum of neighborhood life. But the memory of his way, slow, deliberate, respectful, still exists in fragments, in the tone of an old neighbor telling a story, in the way some older men still describe how business should be handled, in the contrast they draw between the years of quiet profit and the chaos that followed. The mob moves on quickly. Alliances shift, names disappear, and the next boss takes the chair. But some figures leave a kind of echo. Phil's was never about being the loudest man in the room. It was about walking into that room and having everyone know they'd been heard, even if they didn't get exactly what they wanted. Perhaps that's why his end felt so sharp, because it wasn't just the loss of a man, but the loss of a way of operating, a philosophy that power didn't always need to be proven in blood. For a brief moment in time, the Chicken Man's Philadelphia believed in that, and then, just as quickly, it was gone.